Hello, everyone, and welcome to... What are we talking about? We are talking about Leviticus. This is our second session in You've Lost Me at Leviticus, where we're just having some fun and we're going through the book of Leviticus. We haven't even got into it, and today the plan is to get into the very first word. And I am trying out different software this week, so hopefully I'm going to check here and see if I'm actually streaming, because there we go. I'm streaming. I'm live. Okay. Excellent. Okay. Hopefully this week the stream will be a lot better. I went back and I looked afterwards, and the audio and video was completely out of sync and looked pretty terrible to me. So the software that I had subscribed to on the internet, I am going to cancel after this month because it's not working. So anyways, beyond that, welcome everyone. We got some pretty good feedback from the first session. I had a couple questions, and so let's start off with kind of going over some of these questions. The first one was, should I, and this wasn't actually directed at me particularly, but it was kind of generated from this, I feel. Someone asked about Jacob Milgram's commentaries on the book of Leviticus, and there's two excellent commentaries. There is the Leviticus Continental commentary. As you can see, it's, I don't know, like 300-ish pages. Yeah, 350 pages or so. And that covers the entire book of Leviticus. So you could get that one, or you could get this one. As you can see, this volume here is over 1,000 pages, and it only covers chapters 1 through 16. There's actually 2 more volumes of this. Which one should you buy? Buy this one. Buy this one. If you really want to dig into Leviticus, get the other ones. I only have one hard copy of it. I have the other ones that I have are in Logos Bible software, which is my favorite way of studying. And honestly, I haven't even tried to read the bigger set because it's a lot to read that. It's a ton of pages there. And so what I would recommend is, if you really want to dig into it, get this one. And the nice thing is in his Continental commentary, he actually will, if he wants to explain something, he'll like reference his larger volume. So if you really want to dig into something a little bit deeper, there you go. You can jump into the bigger one and reference that little bit, rather than trying to read. I think the entire 3-volume set is like 2,600 pages. And I don't know anyone who's got that amount of time to just sit there and read 2,600 pages. I mean, it'd be fantastic if we all could, but, you know. The other one was, the question was, in today's teaching you mentioned the scripture structure is the temple. What are some resources on this topic? Fantastic question. And what I would say the number one resource to really understand that, now there's probably some other ones out there, but it is a book by Michael Morales, and I'll pull it up here so you can see it I have it on Logos. Surprise, surprise. Everything I get on Logos. And here it is on the screen for you. It's called Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord? A Biblical Theology of the Book of Leviticus. This is phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal book. I love all of Michael Morales' books, but this one in particular, he just really goes through and shows, and we're actually going to kind of get into some of this stuff today, discussing how the overall structure of the Bible is this idea of the temple. And we'll figure out, and we'll go into why it is the temple. And he had a follow-up question about, this is a Christian source, is this kind of a Christian ideology? And the answer is probably, because most of Judaism has this idea that the temple is replaced by the synagogue service. And, it is what it is. They have different ideas there, but... Whoops, I did not mean to do that. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how I can also look at the comments here. Nope. Okay. Anyways, I really haven't come across any really good Jewish resources that kind of go into that, but I'm sure there might be some out there. The thing is that it's really when you take a look at the book of Revelation that you really see this, that the entire structure from the beginning to the end of it is all about a temple. And that's because the Garden of Eden is, in fact, a temple. And that's a very key thing for us to really understand, is how this all relates to the temple. I'm going to try one more thing here to see if I can, and I do apologize, I'm just not going to be able to look at the comments on right now, but we'll be able to kind of get in and look later. Okay, so that was that question, and let's see, the next question, last question, was after listening to the intro to Leviticus, which I really enjoyed, I was reminded of several teachings I heard about how we are all sinners from birth because of sin in the blood. No reference was ever given other than church dogma. He looked into it, wasn't able to find anything. Is he missing something? Okay, great question, because yeah, I was kind of raised with this, and if I remember the one verse that they key on in is in the Psalms, where he talks about, I was a sinner from my mother's womb, I was born in sin, something to that effect. And first off, I would say we really need to pay attention to the genre of literature of the Psalms. The Psalms, as I discussed last week, can be wildly abused and really isn't something that we should be taking some sort of sound theology from without really investigating, is this something that that this author, this poet is stating as an absolute fact about reality, or is this just something that he is feeling, that he feels that he has lived his entire life in sin? So that's something that we want to take a look at. Excuse me, but wow. But I do believe that we will kind of see, really as we get into today, what I would say a more correct understanding of this thing in the scripture is this idea of kind of being born in sin, where we really have to start off by looking at is, what is sin? What is sin biblically? And I think that there is a pretty large misunderstanding of what sin is. Even from the perspective of, because a lot of times I'll ask the question, what is sin? And the typical response is, well, sin is a violation of the law. Okay, that is a response, but that really doesn't tell me much about the nature of sin and what's going on with sin. And so as we kind of look deeper into this concept of what is sin and what's the big problem with it, there are several different answers. Number one, there is this kind of idea that, sin is a bad thing, and it's ultimately, when you sin, it's making God upset, and therefore God either he wants to kill you because it angers him, or he has to serve justice, which, by the way, justice is a pagan god in the Roman pantheon. And so he's even though he wants to forgive you, he's incapable of forgiving you without a penalty being paid. And so these are the predominant ideas. There is also this kind of idea of a heavenly book, where you kind of get green check marks or red X's, and if you have too many red X's, then you don't get into the afterlife sort of thing. And yeah, we actually see some of this kind of ideas generated in the Second Temple period, this idea of a heavenly book and things like that. And I would propose to you that is one way of looking at it, but it's not necessarily the best way of looking at it. And where I want to take you before we really jump into the text of Leviticus, because I think that understanding the nature of sin is important, is I actually want to take you to Luke chapter 15. In Luke chapter 15, which if you're on the website, I would highly recommend, if you haven't watched it, watch my Gospel Cycle series video on Luke chapter 15, because we'll go a lot more in depth. I'm going to give you a very, very basic overview of the story of the Prodigal Son. It's also, I believe I also have it on just on the website as well, because I did this at a conference in for Hanukkah. And so I believe that there's like a separate teaching that I had done on the Prodigal Son. I'm trying to look it up right now. I think that's actually listed under the free teachings. Let me... Book of Ruth at Shavuot. Ah, yes, okay. So what you'll want to do, you can go into the free teaching section, so you don't even have to sign up for a membership. This is great. And there's a teaching called Paralyzing Fear, Hanukkah 2019. So check out that video. That was shot in, Founded in Truth in the South, in South Carolina. That video will go in much more in depth in this idea of sin. So why do I bring up, when we're talking about sin, why do I bring up this parable? It's because this parable in particular really is Yeshua's response to an accusation that he doesn't take sin seriously. So let's begin by looking at the context. Remember the 3 rules of interpretation: context, context, context. And so the parable of the prodigal son, by the way, who is the prodigal son and who is the elder son? See, a lot of times we have heard people say, well, the prodigal son, that's the northern kingdom, and the elder son is the southern kingdom. Sorry, that's not the context of the chapter. Maybe we can have a spiritual application there, but that is not at all the context of what's going on. The context that sparks the whole parable is this: now the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to hear him. Now, by the way, drawing near is a term that we're going to find over and over again in Leviticus. And the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Okay, are you with me now? Now, who in the parable of the prodigal son receives a sinner and eats with him? The father. The father receives the younger son and eats with him, and this makes the older son mad. Okay, so who is the prodigal son? It's the sinners and the tax collectors that Yeshua has been eating with. Who is the elder son? It is the scribes and the Pharisees that are grumbling against Yeshua. They're upset that he is eating with sinners and tax collectors. Okay, so the underlying accusation, when they are complaining that Yeshua is eating with sinners and tax collectors, what are they really complaining about when we get down to it? They are complaining that Yeshua must not really think sin is a big problem. If he's eating, by the way, eating with someone was one of the most intimate things outside of having physical, sexual relationships that you could do. Pharisees wouldn't even eat with other Pharisees. They would only eat with their inner group of people. It was a very intimate act to sit at the same table and eat with someone. So the fact that Yeshua is eating with sinners and tax collectors, by the way, tax collectors, not only were they taking your money, but they were giving it to Rome. And Rome was the nation that was occupying Israel. They were the beast system of that day and time. They're collaborating with the enemy. They're the worst of the worst. Almost as bad as the Samaritans. So, we have this accusation. Yeshua, you must not really take sin seriously. And so Yeshua tells them a parable, which is actually 3 different stories, but we're only going to focus on the prodigal son right here. So this prodigal son, he says to his father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. So he wants the stuff. He wants the blessing, but he doesn't ask for the inheritance, because by using the word inheritance, it would imply that he has responsibilities that he's going to carry on towards the family. He just wants all the stuff. Now, why? Let's stop and let's analyze what's going on here. Why does this younger son, why does he ask for the share of the inheritance? Why does he want this stuff, and why does he want to leave? Because life is boring in his dad's house. He's been living at home, and it's just no fun living under the father's rules. Now, let's take this and let's kind of apply this to the bigger, broader situation of sinners and tax collectors. Why are people sinners? Yeshua is telling us a very important thing. People are sinners not because they're incapable, but because they have the wrong mindset. They think, and trust me, I was there. I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I thought it would be fantastic because we kept most of the commandments, right? Outside of like the feasts, and there was a couple of little things here and there. We kept the majority of, we kept the Sabbath, the dietary laws, all these things, and I thought, man, I'm just gonna, when I move out of the house, I'm just gonna go live my life the way I want to, and I'm gonna do like a deathbed confession and get in. I was the prodigal son. I thought that living under the rules of the house, living in a system of keeping God's commandments, was going to make me miserable. And so God did to me what the father does to the prodigal son. He says, "Here you go, enjoy." God gives us that freedom to be sinners. Now, what happens? What happens? What does sin end up doing? Did sin make the father want to kill his son? No. Did sin in this parable, does the father have some book that he's writing down all the bad things that his son is doing? No. Sin has shattered the relationship. So we have a relationship issue, but look what happens. Yes, the son goes out and parties and has fun, but he ultimately ends up realizing that living this life apart from the father's house, apart from the father's rules, just is not sustainable. And it leads him into a field herding pigs, a Jewish boy herding pigs, and he's looking at the pods that he was feeding to them and wishing he could eat them. What does that mean, by the way? Why couldn't he eat those? Because human beings cannot digest them. So the implication there is that he wishes he could become an animal. Sin has dehumanized this son. It has made him like a beast. And that's something that we find in Psalms. Psalms 115, Psalms 135. The idols of the nations are silver and gold. They have eyes but cannot see, ears but cannot hear, mouths but cannot speak. Those who make them and those who worship them become like them. There's a biblical principle of you become like what you worship. And this son is trying to become like a pig. He's trying to become like a pig. And so he came to himself. Now, biblically, you don't come to yourself, you come to God. And he said, hey, my father's hired servants have enough bread. I'm going to go to my father and say this: Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. Now, where have we heard that phrase before? That was uttered on the lips of Pharaoh in the Exodus. Anyone hearing that story would immediately know this son is full of it. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Ooh, what does that mean? A hired servant is someone who has skills. They can have skilled labor. Now, does this son have any skills? No. Otherwise, he wouldn't be feeding pigs in a field. So how would he get skills? Well, he needs to apprentice under someone. Who in the world is going to apprentice a son who treated his father in such a horrible manner? No one. And so what is going on? When this son comes back to his father, he's just as lost at the edge of that village as he was out in those fields, because he still wants something from his father. He didn't come back to restore the relationship. He didn't come back to really truly repent. He came back because he needs daddy to put in a good word so that he can go and live in someone's house and apprentice under them. That is what Yeshua says about sin. And yet the father instantly forgives all of that, rushes out to meet him, and this act breaks this son down, and he drops off this selfish request, and he's restored back into the father's house. He doesn't repay everything. He doesn't start living. He doesn't have to keep the rules. All he's got to do is just give up and come in and celebrate with the father. Now, that being said, what happens if after the party he decides he's going to take his stuff and go back out into those fields? Well, he's going to end up right back with the pigs. Right? So Yeshua's not teaching greasy grace, but what he's talking about is when you come back into the fold, the first thing that we do is we party. We celebrate. We give a showing that you're welcome. Come as you are. You can learn the rules of the house as we go on. But this angers the elder brother. And so the elder brother takes issue, and he refuses to come into the party. He refuses to celebrate. And this, by the way, is a huge insult in that culture. The elder son was required by social standards to go into that party and represent the family. And so his refusal to go into the party is a huge insult to the father, just as insulting as when this younger son took everything and left. And yet the father again shows this act of merciful love and leaves his own party and goes out and pleads with his son. But listen to what the son responds with. Listen to this elder son. By the way, this older son is also in a field. And he said look at what he says here. Going a little bit further down. He answered his father. By the way, he doesn't even address his father as father. He says, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I could celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours has devoured your property with prostitutes, and you killed the fatted calf for him." What's going on here? This son refuses to accept that the father could forgive his younger son without making him go through all of these bells and whistles and jumping through hoops. And look at this older son's attitude. "I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends." The older son has the exact same attitude as the older son, or as the younger son. The older son has the exact same attitude towards the father's house and his commandments as the younger son. He thinks the father's commandments make his life miserable, and he resents the fact that the father has forgiven his brother without his brother doing anything to deserve it, and therefore he is breaking the relationship. And so Yeshua is saying, hey, guess what? You can be a sinner through sinning, or you can be a sinner through keeping the commandments and being miserable. Thinking it's all about that relationship. It's all about your attitude. Yeah, you might keep the feasts. Yeah, you might keep the Sabbath. You might eat kosher. You might say the name properly. But if you're doing all these out of a sense of entitlement and not a sense of joy, it's going to show through. And when someone else comes in and they don't live up to your standards, and you speak out against them, that's just as much a sin as what that kid was doing out in the field partying. So that is Yeshua's theology of sin. And again, if you want to check out a much further explanation, check that out, Luke chapter 15 on the website, faithandmessiah.com, or the Paralyzing Fear teaching from Hanukkah 2019. So, hopefully that answers the question. And now let's get into Leviticus. We're going to look at the very first word in the book of Leviticus, and then we're going to be done for the day. Okay, here we go. "And the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying..." Now, if you look over here on the other side of your screen, we've got the very first Hebrew word is Vayikra. Vayikra. You can see this. You can see the kara here, and then on the bottom, if you're looking down here, this is what's called a reverse interlinear. So it kind of breaks it up to show you how the Hebrew words are. So we've got the vav and the yikra. Vayikra. So, why do I find the very first word so fascinating? Well, thank you for asking. The reason why is because this is the only book in the entire Bible that begins with a vav. The only book in the entire Bible that begins with a vav. Okay, well, there's probably other books that have a unique letter. What's so interesting about the vav? Because the vav is the word and. Now, how many books have you ever picked up? Let's say that I got this Tabernacle prefigured book, and I turn to page 1, and here on page 1, the first word is at, but what if I picked it up and it said and? What would I probably do? I'd probably flip the page backward and go, and what? What's going on? You don't start with a conjunction. You start with something. So the fact that Vayikra, Leviticus, starts with an and is extremely significant. What does it signify? It signifies that whatever is going to follow the word Vayikra can only be understood within the framework and the reference of what came before. And so what came before Leviticus? Not a trick question. Exodus. Exodus came before Leviticus. Now, what is significant about the book of Exodus? Exodus starts with a group of people living as slaves in a land of Egypt, a land not their own. And they cry out to God, "Save us," which would imply that they are experiencing a very real absence of God. The psalmist captured this sense perfectly when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's a sense of abandonment. We've probably all felt this at some point in our life where things are going wrong, and even though you know that God is omnipresent, even though that you know that God, there's nowhere that you can run and hide from God's presence, you feel abandoned. You feel as if God is not there. And that is the feeling that a group of people enslaved in a foreign land would very much be feeling at this point in time. So, if Exodus starts with the very real absence of God, what happens in the flow? This is going to be extremely important that we understand Leviticus not as a bunch of arbitrary laws. It's not a manual for the priests. It wasn't like, oh, hey, you're 13. Here's the priestly manual, and I want you to read it, and then you can go out and start performing sacrifices. In fact, if you read Leviticus, you wouldn't be able to perform any of the sacrifices. It doesn't actually give you very good instructions on how to actually perform those sacrifices if you are a priest. And so we've got to come to the conclusion that Leviticus is not a manual for the Levites. It's not a manual for the priests. It's not something that was handed to them. Leviticus is something that uses priestly concepts and explanations to tell a much bigger point. And because it begins with the word and, it must be understood within the framework of the story of the Exodus experience. If we try to separate it out and treat it as a bunch of individual laws divorced from the Exodus experience, we're going to come away with some bad understanding. Now, how would they train a priest? Well, it's called apprenticeship. Your mom would raise you and teach you things, and then as you got older, you'd begin to start going to the temple and learning, watching your father do things, and being taught through hands-on experience. It wasn't about reading Leviticus. In fact, Leviticus probably really didn't even become important until well after the Exodus. In fact, I would argue that Leviticus probably really didn't become an important text until the Babylonian exile, until they no longer had the ability to go down to the temple and actually watch the service being performed. Interesting concept, huh? Yeah. Okay, so Exodus begins with a very real absence of God, and the flow of the story goes from them being enslaved in Egypt without God's presence, in a sense, to Mount Sinai, where they see the presence of God on the mountaintop. They hear the voice of God. They experience him in the fire on the mountaintop. By the way, Moses experienced, when he first experiences God's presence, how does he experience it? In a burning bush. And now an entire mountain is ablaze with the presence and the glory of God. Do you see how the fire represents God? Represents the presence of God, represents God's favor in the camp. And we're going to see that's very important as we get to the altar, where there's a fire that you put your animals on in order to give them to God. So, we began with the absence of God. Now they're at Mount Sinai, and the presence of God is there on the mountain. And they're amazed, and they have this incredible experience where God speaks to them, and they all say that all that we hear we will obey. And Moses reads the book of the covenant in front of the people, and they say all that Moses has said we will hear and we will obey. And so he has a covenant making ceremony where he takes blood of animals and he sprinkles it on the altar, and he sprinkles the other half of it on the people. Ever after that, connecting the people to the altar. This is one of the functions of the blood, is to connect two things together. The people to the altar. And so now when the people sin, their sins are going to affect the altar. This is why when we get into Leviticus chapter 4, we're going to see that the blood is not placed on the sinner. The blood is wiped on the horns of the altar. Because of that covenant at Mount Sinai, they have been connected to the altar, and therefore when they sin, it affects the altar, and it defiles the altar, and there is a need for them to go and cleanse the altar. After this, Moses goes partially up the mountain with a big group of people, the elders, the representatives of Israel, and it says they ate and they beheld God's presence. They eat those sacrifices. They have a celebration, a party, which is the first thing you do when you come back to God. You have a party, you have a celebration. That's what Yeshua was doing. He was following the pattern we see in Exodus. By the way, the ordering of the sacrifices in Leviticus, does it start off with a sacrifice to cleanse you from your sins? A sacrifice of repentance? No, it doesn't. In fact, repentance, taking care of your sinful issues, is the last thing that we come to in the order of the sacrifices. It begins with the olah, the whole burnt offering, presenting yourself before God, the mincha, the grain offering, a gift to the king. And then we get to the shalomim, the peace offering, which is basically a holy barbecue. It's a chance for you to sit down and eat some meat in the presence of God and celebrate and enjoy with your friends. Yeshua wasn't doing something unbiblical by eating with sinners and tax collectors. He was following the example set forth in the book of Leviticus. And it's really cool. The more that we study Leviticus, the more we're going to find that the New Testament is permeated with concepts that come straight out of Leviticus. Rather than Yeshua going, well, that's a worthless book, we're going to just do away with all of that. I'm going to propose to you, it's going to be very hard to understand properly the Gospels and the apostolic writings without engrossing ourselves in the book of Leviticus. And everyone's always told us, hey, that's an outdated thing. That's gross and disgusting. Really? Yeshua, remember when he said the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and body, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, where did he get this idea of love your neighbor as yourself from? He got it from Leviticus. And have we got that down? Is that something that we can just go, oh, that old love your neighbor as yourself, we figured that one out years ago. We can move on to the meat now. No, we still live in a society, we still live in religious groupings that can't get love your neighbor as yourself down. So, after this beautiful mountainside meal, where they are able to behold the presence of God through the eating of the animals. Notice the connection there. Moses goes up to the top of the mountain. He's the only person in the entire camp who's able to get back into God's presence. Now, why is that significant? Well, in order to truly understand the significance of Moses going to the top of the mountain and why that would have been so impactful on the people, we've got to go back to the last time that a human being was in the presence of God. And when was that? That was, of course, Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void. Yes, that original poem of the creation of the cosmos is very significant. It's extremely significant. And we don't have time to go into all of this today. You can check out my Torah portions on this, or again, I'd highly recommend the teaching, A Gift of Fire and Blood, Leviticus Then and Now. You can get it on the website, faithandmessiah.shop, and then for Platinum members, you can preview the video on the site as well. And we go through and we talk about there is so much significance here in these opening chapters of Genesis. First off, the creation account of the story of the world. To an ancient Near Eastern person, they would have read this very differently than us. See, we've been taught that the author of Genesis was trying to give us good ammunition to fight the ideology of evolution. The thing is that in that day and time, nobody believed in evolution. Nobody believed in evolution. So the author clearly wasn't writing a polemic against evolution. And no one really even cared about the material origins of the universe. That's something that people in our day who have way too much time to sit around and just think about things start to worry about. Think about the last time you went in for a job interview. How many of you, when you went into the building, and you're sitting there, and then when they got to the part in the interview, like, do you have any questions for us? You're like, yeah, did you use 2x4s or 2x6s in the construction of this building? And did you use drywall screws or drywall nails? You don't care. You just don't care about those things. Those are abstract things that are only important to the people who built it or the building inspectors. What do you care about? Who's in charge? Is this company sustainable? And what is my function and my role within this company? Can I propose to you that Genesis 1 is fundamentally created to answer those questions? Who's in charge? Is this thing sustainable? And what is my function and role within this thing? Who's in charge? Is it the gods? No, there is one single God who creates everything. There's no multiplicity of gods. There's no battling of gods like these other nations would speak of in their creation stories. Will things be sustained? God set the sun and the moon in order, and he creates light and darkness on day 1, and on day 4 he creates the sun and moon to rule over the function of light and darkness, to rule over the function of time. He separates out this expanse of waters, and then he puts birds and fish to rule over this separation of expanses. He's talking about this is how the world is going to continue to function. That is what is important to people. And by the way, that's the thing when God sets the rainbow in the sky after the ark, he's like, here's the promise. After this, I guarantee you, seed time and harvest and all these things will continue to function. That's what people are worried about. And then, what is our role? What is your role in God's created order? Well, it's right here in Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, let us make man in our image. That word there in the Greek text would be icon. In the Hebrew, it is Tselem. Tselem. And Tselem, by the way, is elsewhere used to speak of an idol. Ooh, wait a minute. God created an idol? Yes. What is the function of an idol? What is the function of an idol? It is not supposed to be the God. It is supposed to represent the God to the people. And so we are called to be image bearers of God. We are called to be God's idols. We are called to represent our God to all of creation. And so when the true idea of an idol or an image, as found in Genesis 1, is, as Professor N.T. Wright likes to put it, it's that of an angled mirror. With an angled mirror, we reflect God's goodness, His justice, His mercy, and His love into all of creation. And creation responds with praises that we reflect back to the Creator through our praise and our worship. This idea of an angled mirror. So we were created to be an image. By the way, where was the image in the ancient Near Eastern world? Where was the image of the god kept? In a temple. You'd keep it in a temple and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heaven and over all the livestock and over all the earth and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So we were created to be God's image, to have dominion over all of creation. And then in verse 28, God blessed them and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it all. And so this idea was God puts them in a garden. And we don't have time to go into it today. You can check out, even if you just look at the PowerPoint on the website for A Gift of Fire and Blood, you can see I just lay out a ton of evidence that the Garden of Eden, the description that is put there, the language that is used in the creation account, mirrors the creation, the construction of the tabernacle. And the layout of the garden in Eden, which is placed eastward in Eden, which would imply there's a west Eden. In fact, let's go ahead and let's just put this up on the screen here, because this is important. Okay, first we're going to see, here is the Israelite Tabernacle. Notice the layout of it. Notice that it is oriented from east to west, and that to enter the tabernacle, you have to come from the east towards the west. You can't come from the west towards the east. And to get back to God's presence, you have to come from the east towards the west. Now, compare that to, the description of the Garden of Eden. It's a garden eastward in Eden, which would imply that there is a west Eden somewhere in there, right? And if there is a west Eden, then we have this structure. And by the way, when we look at the description, that's where the presence of God is it's in this west part of Eden, and he would come into the garden. Now, when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, which direction do they go? They go eastward. And their children set up an altar to the east of the garden, just like here, there's an altar to the eastward of here. And when Cain kills Abel, he's kicked out eastward. So the entire idea that's going on in the Bible is this concept of returning, is that when you violate God's will, when you rebelliously sin against God, you are driven eastward. And so to return to God's presence is to come from the east towards the west. And so the tabernacle is set up as a miniature model, if you will, of Eden, of the Garden of Eden, of West Eden, of all of this area. And so the temple, the tabernacle, it represents a model of the way to return to the presence of God. Everything about it is all about how we as human beings return to the presence of God. Now, why is that significant? Let's jump back into our text and let's look at how the book of Exodus ends. Remember what we talked, that this was all leading up there. So, going back to the framework of our story, Israel, they've come out of Egypt, they've come out of slavery and bondage, they've come out of a place with the absence of God, and they've journeyed to this beautiful mountain where this fiery presence is on the top of it, and their desire is to get back to the presence of God. You see, the Bible is not about lost souls going to heaven. The goal of Scripture has never been about how we as sinners escape earth and go to heaven. The entire structure of the Bible, the entire goal of the Bible is about heaven coming to earth and people being restored back to a state where we can dwell in the presence of God on earth, in this combination of heaven and earth. And so they're there, they're right there, they're so close to being able to go up there, but they've been told if you cross the border, you'll be put to death. Only Moses has been allowed to go up there out of the entire camp. He is the only person who can enter into God's presence, who can essentially return to Eden, if you will. Remember, this is the goal. This is the goal that we are all working towards. So, Exodus, after he goes up the mountain, he receives instructions on how to build this tabernacle. And the tabernacle is said to be like a blueprint. A blueprint. Now, how many of you have ever looked at a blueprint? How many of you have looked at it and immediately realized that a blueprint, it is full of symbols that represent the reality that it is trying to depict, but it does not look like the final structure. When someone hands you a blueprint, it's not like a 3D model of a house that's there for you to look at. It's a bunch of lines with all these weird symbols that abstractly represent certain things within the house. This is what the tabernacle is. It is what is called a microcosm, or what we could also call a blueprint of the cosmos. Because the cosmos, all of reality, was designed to be a temple. And a temple is a place where God and humanity dwell together. And so the tabernacle is it's not a miniature model of some space temple out there. It is a blueprint. It contains symbols that the audience in Leviticus, or the audience coming out of the Exodus, would have understood to represent parts of their reality. We actually see this in Josephus, where he talks about, this represents this part of the heavens and this part of the earth. The bronze basin represents the seas, right? All of these things represent functions and things within our cosmos. Because the idea is not us going to heaven and going to some space temple. It's about heaven coming to earth and about all of reality, all of the cosmos, the universe, being the temple of God. A place where humanity and God dwell together once again, just as it was from the beginning. And so they are given this blueprint, and they are to build out this blueprint so that they can begin to enact these rituals that in and of themselves mean nothing. In and of themselves, these rituals mean nothing. God does not require food. That was a pagan idea. God does not need the temple. The temple was built because we as people needed it. That is our way of connecting to God. God recognizes, especially a hurt group of people coming out of Egypt, they need rituals. Coming out of slavery. Think about, probably one of the best examples is people coming out of alcohol addiction. They need rituals. They need structure. They don't need freedom to do whatever they want and hang out with whomever they want. They need, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go to these meetings because these are going to reinforce certain things that teach you how to have a full and complete life away from that. The Torah is almost like an Alcoholics Anonymous for slavery, if you will. It is teaching a group of people how to go from being slaves to being real, true human beings. And by the way, we are all slaves. The New Testament speaks of Yeshua creating his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, all being part of what's called a new or greater exodus. A new or greater exodus. If you want more information, again, go to the website, or you can get the DVD. It's called The Wrong Messiah, and I go in and I show you how the entire gospel stories are laid out, teaching us about how Yeshua performs a new and accomplishes a new and greater exodus. This time not from slavery to Egypt, not from slavery to Rome, but slavery to sin and death and ultimately Satan. And so, going back to that original question that I was asked, I kind of went in and I talked about sin. Are we born in sin? Yes and no. Yes and no. The way that we talk about it is it's like when you're a baby, God has this like record book of you are deserve to die. No, babies don't deserve to die. God does not want to kill babies. I'm sorry, that's not what the Bible teaches. However, we are all have been born into slavery, into sin. We are all in a state of decay. Because we have been born outside of the garden, yes, we are born into sin, but not sin as in some heavenly record, but more of sin as a master. And we, as mature, believing adults, we have been set free, and our job, our role, our duty is to reflect God's loving compassion and reflect Yeshua's greater exodus to the rest of the world. We are called to set other people free. We are called to perform little exoduses for every person that we meet that is still enslaved to sin. So yes, people are born under sin as the master, and the gospel message is there's a new king. You can be set free. You don't have to stay out in that field of pigs. You can come in, and we're going to rejoice. We're going to have a party. But once we have that, you're going to have to learn how to live in the house, because otherwise you're going to end up back in that field feeding pigs, wishing you were a pig again. Does that make sense? Is that kind of starting to put everything together? For me, I mean, this was just, wow. Yes. I love it. I love how everything just makes so much sense, especially when you look at these underlying structures of the tabernacle. The tabernacle is Eden. And so the tabernacle is all about how do we, as people born into slavery to sin, how do we have our exodus and get back to the garden? This is going to be an underlying theme, by the way, the entire book of Leviticus. We're going to continue to talk about this idea of getting back to the garden. So they build the tabernacle. They build this blueprint, this model, and it says Moses finished his work. I want to take you here. Whoops, not the PowerPoint. Let's go to Logos. This is in Exodus 40. Verse 33, he erected the courtyard around the tabernacle and the altar and set up the screen in the courtyard. So Moses finished the work. Notice how that's related to Genesis. So God finished all the work that he had done, and behold, it was good. And then look at what happens next. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting, because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord had filled the tabernacle. And that is where Exodus ends. Had Exodus just ended there, what would have been the big question? We've just escaped from slavery. We've just got to the mountain. We've experienced the presence of God. We've seen the way back to Eden. But the one man who was able to actually go into God's presence at the mountain, now he can't even get in. And so if Moses can't even get in, who can actually enter the temple? Who can ascend the mountain of the Lord? Notice where I got that from. That was from the book by Michael Morales. Michael Morales points this out, and it was just, for me, it was like, oh, mind blown. Amazing connection here, right? Leviticus is set up to answer the question, how do we get into the tabernacle? How do we get back to the presence of God? How do we return to Eden? So that is going to be the focus as we go through the book of Leviticus, is we're going to read it in light of a group of ex-slaves who've just been set free as an instruction manual on how to return to Eden, how to return to restore the presence of the Lord, how to And actually, really, we start to see, by the way, and so, oh man, did I just get cut off? Okay, I think there was a hiccup there. I don't know. I just tried to pull up my thing here to see the comments. Hopefully I'm online. No, it looks like the connection is really not working here. Okay. I think we'll just have to not get onto the comments section. Hopefully you can still see me. But that was really about it. We're going to see how Yeshua as the temple and everything, how this all connects in, how it's all about getting back to the presence of God, and how Revelation is this idea of the garden fulfilled, the mandate to be fruitful and fill the earth, multiply and subdue it, to increase the entire earth to being the temple, how that is being fulfilled there. So, my friends, thank you so much for joining in with me this week. And again, I do apologize. I'm not able to see the comments, and when I did, it just froze this up. So I'm gonna have to get a separate laptop down here, so maybe I can have it streaming over there or figure something on it. There's got to be a way, right? I hope you're enjoying this, and I'm gonna try my best. To do this again next Tuesday. The thing is that Sukkot is coming up in a week and a half, and we are actually leaving. I've got to drive all the way down to Oklahoma with 5 kids in the car, one of them being 1-year-old, so I may not ever make it. No, we'll make it there. And I hope to see at least some of you there at Sukkot. But we're going to be packing up, and I've got I have to work at my job in nursing over the next couple days here. So I'm really going to be rushing, but we're going to try to do it on Tuesday. No promises. We'll see how it goes. We are not going to record during Sukkot because I'm going to be out in the wilderness of Oklahoma. But we'll be back the following week after Sukkot. So one last little announcement is I had a really great question from someone who was interested in doing their own sort of teachings and kind of live streaming to their group. And they asked me about the equipment that I use and how I did this setup. I'm going to actually, here in a little bit, I'm going to live stream, and I'm going to show you some of the equipment that I use in case you're interested in doing some sort of thing here. You can get some ideas for some equipment. So stay tuned for that here shortly. All right. Thank you guys.